This video is about why we think what we think. It's about how a human being in a universe 93 billion light years across makes sense of the infinity he lives in. It's about how some nations that live upon the speck we call the Earth grow and flourish. It's about how others wither and die. Finally, it's about what your place is in all of that. This podcast is an attempt to adumbrate and to give the contours of how the philosophical enterprise of the last 3,000 years, the way that philosophy has marched forth in its martial array throughout all ages of history, throughout all countries, and throughout all times, how that march of intellectual erudition has been brought forth to bear upon what we're going to explain today as historical consciousness, which is how we view ourselves, how we find our way through the world around us, how we make sense of all of the vast brilliance and luminance of the cosmos around us. In a word, this podcast is an attempt to ask the question over and over again in 1,000 unique and 1,000 glittering ways. How has the history of thought, ideas, and philosophy, the history of literature, fundamentally changed the shape of the human race, the form of our thought, the mode of our cognition, the way in which we little sailboats among the mighty seas of the world course our way through the waves and the currents? How has the history of philosophy changed the way that mankind as a whole views the world it lives in, how it views its own self, and even that most scintillating and that most piercing of questions? How has what has come before us, the thoughts of the men of old, and indeed the thoughts of men today, formed us, formed you and I, in such a way that we view ourselves in a set manner and in a set way? How have words which you and I have never heard before, have never seen written on a page, been indicted and written into our very blood and into our very brains from before the day we were born? And so that's what this podcast is going to, in a word, be seeking as we come out with new videos. What we're going to be doing in this is we're going to be looking at great men of the past, great writers. They may be philosophers, they may be politicians, they may be poets, they may be storytellers, they may be men of all strands and stripes of society. But they're going to share this in common, that they were the rumblers and shakers of their age, the architects who built the edifice of a new age and a new shape of mind. And we're going to survey various people like that, tracing even into the realms of modern happenings, into current events, and any manner of things like that, to ask the question, how has the mind of man, in all of its 1,000 manifestations littered upon the sphere of time, geography, and history, how has the mind of man progressed in its 1,000 manifestations? And then bringing that together to ask the question, what does that mean for you and I today? So that's the fundamental animus motivating this podcast. In this first episode, we're not going to be talking about any specific individuals. Rather, what I want to do is to lay forth an intellectual prolegomena, all of the stuff that we need to lay on the table before going and talking about individual men throughout history, currents and movements throughout philosophical and literary thought. Basically, what I want to do is to provide a methodological basis to put some of my cards on the table as to how I think, and ask for any of you who might be watching, if I see the world this way, do you perhaps think that you may think that you see it a bit of the same way as well. And so that's what we're aiming at today. And the subject that we're going to be talking about, and indeed what we're going to be talking about throughout every single episode of this podcast,
is called historical consciousness, which is how a people at a given state of time, or indeed the mass of humanity as it stands strewn across all of the centuries and millennia of history, how they view the world, the interconnectivity of all of their modes of thought, the figures which dominate their imagination, the images which come forth to play in all of their dreams, their reveries, their ways in which they react to one another and to the world. And so to begin talking about that, I want to start by founding the concept of something called a cosmogony. So what's a cosmogony? It's a fancy way of saying a map of the world. And it's not merely a map of the world as you might have within an atlas or on your GPS for all of you modern techie people of Gen Z. Rather, a cosmogony is the mind's map of how the world and how the universe is arrayed. And so when you and I come into this world, how do we come into the world? We come screaming and crying, wailing as little babies, knowing nothing of the world, knowing nothing of the broad mountains that dot its landscape, knowing nothing of the vast seas which stretch and puncture into the world's crust. We know nothing of the vast land of Egypt over the sea with its mighty pyramids, the Tower of Paris, which goes up and mounts up to the sky, scraping the very clouds. We know nothing of the Empire State Building. But day by day, as we come to see things on TV, as we hear things from our parents, we slowly have a map of the world etched within the contours of our mind. And so at any given time, as societies, we build up maps of how the world works. The most famous example of this in history has been the idea of geocentrism or heliocentrism, which has much billing in today's scientific atmosphere. We all know of the fact that in the old Ptolemaic system, people believed the world, all of the universe, rotated around the Earth, and that was called geocentrism. But with the rise of men like Galileo, who with his peering telescopes was able to see into the heights of the heavens, we found out that Copernicus's theory was correct and that we lived in a heliocentric galaxy. Fast forward 500 years from that, and we telescope out even further, and we find that we don't merely live in a heliocentric universe. We live in a vast plethora of many galaxies like our own, of which there is no center, no axle, and no hinge. And the galaxies freewheel in many whirlpools, as it were, of stretching light and fancy among an infinitely vast cosmos with no center, no axle, no hinge, no place of reference. And we, as Carl Sagan once said, are a pale blue dot suspended in a vast black background. And so C.S. Lewis illustrated this probably better than anyone else in his little book, The Discarded Image. The change from a heliocentric worldview, or rather the change to a heliocentric worldview, is one not merely of astrological significance. It's not something that merely affects how we view the Earth. Rather, it changes everything about how we view the universe, and hence the idea of cosmogony. This is what C.S. Lewis said in The Discarded Image. If the reader will suspend his disbelief and exercise his imagination for only a minute, I think he will understand the vast readjustment involved in a perceptive reading of the old poets. He will find his whole attitude of the universe inverted. In modern, that is evolutionary thought. Man stands at the top of a stair whose foot is lost in obscurity. In this, the medieval model, he stands at the bottom of a stair whose top is invisible with light. And so, when our cosmogonies change, the universe changes. Lewis, in that same book, he discusses how the medievals would have looked up at the heavens and seen a massive building stretching up with various very ordered stair steps of a universe that is fundamentally ordered, that is geometric. Whereas, as you and I, if we watch some sci-fi show, we view space very, very differently. You and I will look at space as an endless sea with no beginning and no end, but mere lapping remoteness that extends out unto an infinity which our mind cannot comprehend. And so, that's the idea of cosmogony, that each of us lives in a world by which we orient our lives, by which we make sense of who we are. For the medieval, he was a cog, perhaps you may say, in a vast machine, going on to some vast, glorious enterprise. The planets revolved like cogs in a wheel, working out and churning out some great design. For us, we are castaways on a desert island. And you see this oftentimes in the language of places in history where people have been brought to the remotest places of their lives. And this summons forth an idea of adventurousness, an idea of conquest. And the things that we think of as conquesting, innovating, going to the stars today would have been very different for men of the past. It can be said that the trip over the ocean, which was unfathomable to our very recent ancestors, which would have been grueling, is something of almost a hop, skip, and a jump for us today. Take, for instance, what is said in Tacitus's work Agricola, when the Romans come and invade Britain and push the Britons onto the furthest place of the isle to the very northern tip of Britain. This is the speech that's given upon that situation. We, the noblest sons of Britain, and therefore stationed in its last recesses, far from the view of servile shores, have preserved even our eyes unpolluted by the contact of subjection. We, at the furthest limits, both of land and liberty, have been defended to this day by the remoteness of our situation and of our fame. The extremity of Britain is now disclosed, and whatever is unknown becomes an object of magnitude. But there is no nation beyond us, nothing but waves and rocks, and the still more hostile Romans whose arrogance we cannot accept by obsequiousness and submission. These plunderers of the world, after exhausting the land by their devastations, are rifling the ocean, stimulated by avarice if their enemy be rich, by ambition if poor, unsatiated by the east and by the west. The only people who behold wealth and indigence with equal avidity, to ravage, to slaughter, to usurp under false titles, they call empire, and where they make a desert, they call it peace. And so that seems like a little squabble to you and I. But to the men who lived there, they viewed it like this. We are at the northernmost extremity of the world, past which there is no civilization, past which there is no life. It would be like going out to Mars and staking a claim there, a grand battle that happened on a galactic sphere. And so the old and hallowed fairy of the old world, in which Britain, the peak of Britain, was a place remote, unknown, savage, dangerous, queer unto our sense and capacities. That is something that has been entirely lost. To take again Juan Luis Vives, the great man of the 1500s, who launched forth an educational regime that took Europe by storm. Juan Luis Vives writes to the king of his nation, "The explorers of our day, men like Columbus, have shown us the path of the heaven and the sea, before not even known by name. They have also discovered peoples and nations who perform marvelous religious rites and are in a state of barbarism, though possessing wealth, on which our people so keenly cast their affections. The whole globe is opened up to the human race, so that no one is so ignorant of events as to think that the wanderings of the ancients whose fame reached to heaven are to be compared with the journeys of these travelers, either in the magnitude of their journeyings or in the difficulties of their routes, or in their accounts of unheard of conditions of life of the various nations who give us a rude shock by their differences from us in appearance, habit, and custom. In that day, finding the New World was almost like finding life on another planet. It was such a shock to Europe as a whole." So why do I give you these little vignettes? I give them to you for this purpose, to show this, that our cosmogony, our map of what the world is like, our concern over how things generally work in the world, fashion the dramas of our lives. And so, if we are to ask the question, who are we? Who am I? Who are you? We must first ask the question, in what world do we live? What is the universe in which my life and your life occurs? What part do I have to play in a larger whole? And that's the goal of this podcast, to shed light on how we view the world and have viewed the world throughout history. Indeed, how men of the past have shaped our cosmogonies, how we view the world, how we make sense of the vast and brilliant cosmos in which we are situated in this little plot of dust and ground which we call the earth. This marvelous place filled with all manner of coursing streams with running trouts, of green grass that greens the ground, of steep insurmountable mountains, and all such things. And so this kind of has to do with what J.J. Gilson in the last century wrote of as affordances in his book, An Ecological View of Visual Perception. He posited in the last century a view of human beings that cuts a middle line through what he calls the subjective and the objective. And that was what he called the idea of affordances. It was a term that he coined himself. Say I have this computer here, or yon desk over here. They are not merely objects. And whenever you look at a field of vision, you don't see individual objects. Rather, you see a blur of images. And this is especially true for children who don't have much experience of the world. Rather, you see a few things that are useful for you in your environment. And so, for instance, the desk that's here to my right might serve not as a desk, but as a wall, because it affords to me a tangible surface that I can't get past. And so what that means is that whenever we come to a place that we've never seen before, a new building, for instance, a new playground, a new walk, a new city, we are very set on edge until we've parsed out all the affordances in it. We have to go to every nook and every cranny and ask, what are the means of safety that I might afford to myself? What are all the dangers? And this is the instinct that we have when we move into a new house, to go and look into every corner to set things aright. And that's somewhat of what we do in a cosmogony. A cosmogony, a map of the world, limits the thoughts we can think and the actions we can take. A cosmogony includes all of the great heroes of the past and all of the great villains. It contains all of the mightiest virtues that we might append to ourselves and all the worst and most vicious vices. It contains all means of satisfaction and all means of disappointment. It contains all means of rejuvenation and all means of crushing atrophy for ourselves. And so that's why a cosmogony matters. And taking that long, but I believe necessary diversion, we come back to the topic which we set out from, a topic which rises out from the background of the cosmogony, and that is what is called historical consciousness. So, this is what I mean by historical consciousness. You can imagine all of the throbbing and all of the vitalizing complexity of human systems as they have emerged and proliferated throughout the years of history. And you can take every single time in history at a given point and map every single man, woman, and child that has ever existed in a given period as little nodes on a map. Now you can take all of the interrelations between them, match them together, and you have what I call historical consciousness. What you have essentially is a neural map. So, for instance, you can take all of the works that have been written, say in 1640, 1641, 1643, and 1642, and so on, and you can look at that basically as saying, I have all of the nodes of the people who live at this time and all of their interrelations, and they act in a certain way. There is a certain cosmogony that emerges from these inner societal and political relations. And that is what I call the historical consciousness. You could call it the medieval mind, the Enlightenment mind, the Reformation mind. You may call it the modern mind. And you can see that these modes of thought act in a peculiar way unto each. And as you go forward, you can see that year by year, this neural network, which has these nodes, which are incredibly important, say a work has been cited thousands upon thousands of times in that span of time, as the years go by, that major node might become more and more minor until it dwindles away. And so you can look at history as a collection of sequential human minds that morph and transfigure themselves through time, in which various sources grow to prominence and then they fade away as more and more aspects of society grow and proliferate and bring things centrifugally away from the center into a new center. And that shift is the shift of historical consciousness throughout history. This is somewhat of an idea that was espoused by the father of structuralism, Ferdinand de Saussure, who invented the science of semiotics or semiology. How he termed it was that every culture has a system of signs, namely a language, because that term semiotics came from his work, A Course in General Linguistics. He's also the father of modern linguistics. But he said that every culture has a language, and a language is fundamentally a system of signs in which you can imagine a circle here, a word here, a word here, a word here has meaning. And they all have meaning within this sphere. If you take the word away, say a word like wood, for instance, it doesn't have any meaning apart from its system. Rather, the word wood, which could mean in two different instances, wood, like I would do this, or there's wood on that tree over there. And those are two ways of uttering the same sound that would produce different semantic meanings. And so we can discern from that reality that all of our language, indeed the modes of our cognition, the ways in which you and I think every day, indeed the lenses through which we see the world, come through what in cognitive terms or physiological terms is called opponent processing. That and this is how we see in colors, for instance, that you have red, blue, and yellow. But in the sphere of red and yellow, between there is green. You have these opponents in which red and green are opposed to one another, and so you never see reddish green. You always see either red or green because everything is derived from redness in general, and so to see reddish green is kind of an oxymoron from a bodily perspective. And so all of our language has a situatedness. It finds its place as a member of a larger, grander, and more majestic whole. Every single one of our words, taken away from its language as a whole, ceases to make sense. And it doesn't just apply to language, but to signs in general. This is why, for instance, we all drive on the same side of the road, but in somewhere like Britain, in most places in Europe, actually, they drive on, quote unquote, the wrong side of the road because they drive on the left side of the road and we drive on the right. That's a type of semiology. And semiology is really the understructure, as it were, the equivalent of biochemistry for a medical perspective. It's the equivalent of that for the idea of historical consciousness. Historical consciousness may be seen as the proliferation of signs over time, how they change between cultures and how they change between peoples. And so, for instance, we have drop of a hat phrases, things like by the way, things like down the road, that one time came into our language. Those, in fact, have come very, very far in the past, but have become pivotal and vital ways through which we see the world. And so it is that the idea of cosmogony that we gave earlier makes sense of our semiological systems and grounds the way in which we inhabit and course through the world as we go through our lives. I have a question now that follows from that. Seeing how important these semiological schemes are to making our life make sense, what happens when they break down? There's a great philosopher by the name of Etian Gilson who wrote a work called Unity of the Philosophical Experience, in which he was a man who was nominated 1 or 2 times for the Nobel Prize even. But in Unity of the Philosophical Experience, he utters that man is fundamentally a metaphysical animal. And so what did he mean by that? What he meant was that men, by nature, try to make a unity between everything in the universe. They try to bring all of the disparate things that they see, the golden gleaming of the sun and the blue ocean, the clear air and the thick sludge that comes forth when you let coal burn. We look at all of that and we ask, how are all of these things related? The question, as it was posed, of one and the many. And what happens over time is that people are puzzled by a question which they must find out. And so they build infrastructure, they build edifices which congregate around this central notion, around this central tendency. And these are what we call cultures. Etienne Gilson calls them metaphysics. But what happens when something comes that doesn't fit within our systems? Well, that usually can be incorporated. But if it can't be incorporated, if it comes with such a force and such a blow that the hammer comes straight through the wall and all of our protections lie destroyed and pulverized into rubble, then, Etienne Gilson, comes the rise of a skepticism, a wondering of whether we can know anything at all. And throughout history, we have a shifting and a turning between a rise of a metaphysical certainty, in which we have a semiological sphere that can explain all things, that can comprehend all facts, that can understand heaven and earth and hold it within its hand. And then finding that there was something that in all that time eluded the human mind's cognition and grasp. They go into a deep period of uncertainty. And I think this is illustrated better than anywhere else in a book by Umberto Eco called Name of the Rose. It's a medieval detective novel, actually, but you have a young Franciscan friar who, incredibly young, incredibly agreeable, and he comes to know the greatest men of Europe. But at the end of the book, he finds that everything is just disillusionment. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. And he comes, having seen the debauchery, the hatred, and the lasciviousness of all of Europe, to a place where he is incredibly disenchanted. And this is how the book ends. All I can do is be silent. O quam salubre, quam jucundum et suave est sedere in solitudine et tacere et loqui cum Deo. Soon I shall be joined with my beginning, and I no longer believe that it is the God of glory of whom the abbot spoke to me, or of joy as the Minorites in those days believed, perhaps not even of piety. Gott ist ein lauter Nichts, in ruht kein nun noch hier. I shall soon enter this broad desert, perfectly level and boundless, where the truly pious heart succumbs in bliss. I shall sink into the divine shadow in a dumb silence and an ineffable union. And in this sinking, all equality and all inequality will be lost. And in that abyss, my spirit will lose itself and will not know the equal or the unequal or anything else, and all differences will be forgotten. I shall be in the simple foundation, in the silent desert, where diversity is never seen, in the privacy where no one finds himself in his proper place. I shall fall into the silent and uninhabited divinity, where there is no work and no image. And that's what happens when cultures who believed themselves to be capable fall to the ground. The consequence is moral decay, existential angst, fear in the streets and fear in the citadels, uncertainty among our highest politicians. And I would argue that at the moment we've come to a breaking down of semiological spheres, in which we no longer know how to make sense of the infinite complexity, in fact, the infinite shadows and perturbations of a wide-wheeling and chaotic world. And so we find ourselves uncertain and reeling in the midst of the terror-ridden ineffable. And what happens when you come to that place, as Etian Gilson uttered, of pure skepticism, where the foundations are destroyed, and you know not whether there be men with strength and muscle enough to build, enough rock suited for the building, enough light of the day to supply the workers, and enough bread to fill the hearts of men. Well, often, because nature abhors a vacuum, something comes in and changes, and that can be for either great good, or it can be either for great ill. And it is upon these pendulum swings that the world doth turn. For instance, you can see one man in Martin Luther, who came and who shattered the old semiological sphere. In all the decrepitude and in all the uncertainty of the Middle Ages, as it was drawing unto its senectitude, Martin Luther, in all of his vitality and force, came forth with a hammer in hand, and unto the very church door he stepped forth and drove in a nail, whose knell marked the death knell of the old Europe, and manifested forth a new world, a new way of seeing life, a new semiological scheme, indeed, a new cosmogony. And this was what he said, and these words are words that changed the world. Your most serene majesty of your and your highnesses require of me a simple, clear, and direct answer. I will give one, and it is this: I cannot submit my faith either to the Pope or to the Council, because it is clear that they have fallen into error and even into inconsistency with themselves. If then I am not convinced by proof from Holy Scripture or by cogent reasons, if I am not satisfied by the very text I have cited, and if my judgment is not in this way brought into subjection to God's word, I neither can nor will retract anything, for it cannot be either safe or honest for a Christian to speak against his conscience. Hier stehe ich, here I stand. Ich kann nicht anders, I cannot do otherwise. So hilfe mir Gott. God help me. Amen. And it is in this manner that men step forth in the times of decrepitude, in the times of uncertainty and dismay and fear, and envisage forth a new manner of life. These are the philosophers, these the poets, these the great men of the world. And it is upon these men that our podcast centers. Here is another example, one that perhaps was not as salutary and glorious as Martin Luther, one whom we must shudder in horror to see, and that is the man Adolf Hitler. He had a similar moment when, after he had his beer hall putsch, he was brought to court, and the words he uttered there tore a rift in Europe and in the world, tore a scar in the very tissue of the life and minds of the last century, one which has not been healed, and brought forth all manner of turpitude and all manner of malice. As he was put up, this is what happened, and this is narrated in William Shearer's book, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It was an accurate prediction, but here the presiding judge intervened. Herr Hitler, you say that the Green Police was stained. That I cannot accept. The accused paid not the slightest attention to the admonition. In a peroration that held the audience in the courtroom spellbound, Hitler spoke his final words. The army we have formed is growing from day to day. I nourish the proud hope that one day the hour will come when these rough companies will grow to battalions, the battalions to regiments, the regiments to divisions, that the old cockade will be taken from the mud, that the old flags will wave again, that there will be a reconciliation at the last great divine judgment that we are prepared to face. He turned his burning eyes directly on the judges. For it is not you, gentlemen, who pass judgment on us. What judgment you will hand down, I know. But that court will ask us, did you commit high treason or did you not? That court will judge us, the quartermaster general of the old army, his old officers and soldiers, as Germans who wanted only the good of their own people and fatherland, who wanted to fight and die. You may pronounce us guilty 1,000 times over, but the goddess of the eternal court of history will smile and tear to tatters the brief of the state prosecutor and the sentence of this court, for she acquits us. And those words, like the words of Martin Luther, thundered and rang throughout all the dome of the world, and were to call forth one of the greatest carnages that the world has ever seen. He was a man who stepped forth in a time of uncertainty, in a time when a pound of flour in Germany cost $1 billion, in a time where you would have to bring all of your savings merely to buy your groceries, in a time of incredible perplexity and incredible confusion, when people were looking for firm earth on which to stand. He manifested a vision of life and a vision of the world in which people could go forward to. And as mice will be charmed on by a serpent into its very mouth, so did Hitler, with his strength, take the historical consciousness of Europe and lure it on into his gaping, wide maws. Such is the way that historical consciousness can turn. And that's why I believe this podcast to be of merit. Because if you do not know the history of ideas, and if you do not know the way in which ideas have shaped you, have indeed knit the very fabric of your life, your thought, your cognition, and your being, then you stand as a single man, arrayed unto no side, full of a world of 1,000 enemies, 1,000 different men who would seek either your greatest good or your greatest and most excruciating harm. And these men stand arrayed at any side. What learning the history of ideas does is that as this historical consciousness shudders back and forth as a pendulum swaying in the wind, you may know how the wind may blow. You may come to know all of the inhabitants of the land and to know who are your friends, who are your foes, and in whom does the coming evil, the coming good reside. I'd like to end this particular episode with a little vignette from whence the name of the podcast has been taken. The story of Gordian's knot. You may have heard of Gordian's knot. In the days of Alexander the Great, when he was harrowing and conquesting the kings of Persia, when he was taking the east for his own kingly seat, there was a little town in Persia where there was a knot that was impossible to untie. And it was heralded throughout all of the generations that came before that this knot, which was tied to a golden chariot, if anyone would be able to come and untie its intricate loops, that he himself would be possessor of heaven and earth, that he would conquer the world. And so you can imagine Alexander and all of his troops, after a long day's trek, sweltering in the summer sun with sweat coming down their faces and fatigue hanging heavy in their limbs and hearts. Then he comes into town, and he finds the great philosophers seated around this little knot. And all of them are putting forth ways that they might untie it. Here's Empedocles here. Here's Thales drinking his water. Here is Anaximander. Here is Plato. And here is Aristotle. And Aristotle turns to all of them and says, "Behold, men, I believe we found exactly the boy who's going to unwind this knot for us." And they say, "That boy, your student?" He'll never be able to do it. His hands are too fine from living in the palace. He's not got the roughshod mind of a philosopher. And Alexander, young and bold, he comes up and he says, "Well, allow me to make an attempt." And looking at the knot for a moment, with all of the fingers full of the philosopher's fingers still clenched within it, he draws his blade from its hilt, and he crashes it down and cuts the knot and the fingers of the old philosophers in half. Then he takes the chariot and goes forth into the dusk of the daylight, and looking at the setting of the sun, says, "Behold, I am possessor, conquestor, owner, and king of this world, the new world." You see, what men have thought before, men today act. What men have dreamt in days past, men today summon forth into reality. What happens in the university classroom happens upon the streets in all manner of riots today. And that, my friends, is why you should open the pages of the philosophers of old. It's why you should come to have a taste for the winds of historical consciousness and see how they change day by day. In our next episode, whenever it comes out, we're going to talk about one singular man, one of the men who ushered forth a new age in history, for better or for worse. And so, if you've enjoyed what we've talked about in this short podcast, not really short, then